Richard is an expert, in my view, in all things financial services. And we've asked him to speak a little bit about transparency, and he will certainly get into this very ticklish subject of beneficial ownership. So, Richard, take us wherever you want to in this world of transparency and beneficial ownership.
Okay, Broderick, thanks very much. Pleasure to be here in your beautiful country, and Russell, very grateful for the invitation to come here, particularly in January. Nice time to be in BVI. I know there's many experts in the room on the subject I'm going to speak on, so it's a great pleasure to speak to you too, a very sophisticated audience. I'm a tax lawyer in London with a Canadian firm, of course, partners with Ron Durand, and I have the pleasure of fairly frequent discussions with the UK government on their evolution of their tracking of beneficial ownership for companies. You will know that the United Kingdom has put significant pressure on BVI and the other overseas territories and crown dependencies to follow what I view as a deeply flawed model in the United Kingdom, and I'm going to make a few comments on what the UK has in mind in this regard and how BVI might respond in order to ensure that you prosper in a transparent environment. As you will well know, BVI is globally recognized as a leading center for the establishment of international business companies. This is quite commercially meaningful in this jurisdiction. It funds 60% of the government's budget, and of course it's a major area of financial activity in the private sector in the island. So we're talking about a backbone of the BVI's economy. And there are the program for the United Kingdom to centralize data and perhaps make it public is a serious challenge to BVI, and a sensible response to that is a critical part of your economic health going forward. Now, this is a very lucrative and competitive business. It's no accident that BVI is on top in the world. You do a great job here. Globally, you're the largest offshore center for this type of business, the most successful one. Key reason for that, you have an excellent professional infrastructure here. You have a great government, a very stable government, and critically, you have British institutions. You have British law, you have British trained professionals, you have British courts, and the world trusts British institutions. Now, what's very interesting about this is you often perceive your relationship with the United Kingdom as adversarial in this area. And yet, you are an agent of soft power for the United Kingdom in facilitating the predominance of British legal and cultural institutions worldwide. You and the other overseas territories and the Crown dependencies are successful because of that British-inspired environment, and your activity should be seen as cooperative and symbiotic. This is a point I always make to the UK government. You should regard these centers as their success as rooted in British institutions. You should celebrate and take pride in their ability to deliver British institutions worldwide. You might not be the largest cross-border investor in the world on this island in the United Kingdom anymore, but what BVI and its peers do for you in encouraging the growth of UK legal and cultural institutions is very important for the United Kingdom. So your relationship should be seen as cooperative. It may be vexing that you have to explain and defend your business model, but bear in mind that you have in this island one of the highest per capita incomes in the world, and you wind the clock back 30 years ago with fishing, farming, tourism, etc. It was quite a different story. The world wants to know why you are successful, why you facilitate 4% of FDI in the world. They're curious about this. And in my view, my principal message is it's incumbent on industry to explain to the world why their prosperity is dependent on the activity that you carry on here. This changes the climate for dialogue. When you get to people and you explain that they could damage their own economic interests by foolish policy that impairs your ability to facilitate trade, growth, jobs in their home jurisdiction, pensions growth, when they begin to understand that their policies may adversely impact on their domestic economy in the United Kingdom and the United States, that's a much more powerful agent than saying to them, don't do this, it's not fair to us. So Western governments, they have dire finances. They have a demographic problem, they have big social welfare budgets, they are funding increasing expense in that regard. There's a perception that living standards have declined in Western countries. There may be an element of truth in that, but the fact of the matter is that the equality, much as you would see suggestion otherwise in the media, after taxes and benefits, in the United Kingdom, for example, is the most equal that it's been since 1982. Yet the Western media persists in this notion that inequality predominates, it sells newspapers, etc. Regrets, you are at the center of that, and there is a perception, a very mistaken one, that international business is part of a vast criminal conspiracy. One needs to correct that misimpression. What are the current challenges that you face in international financial centers? Not limited to BVI. I've made this point. I think you need to explain to the large countries how their economic health depends on what you do here. And more particularly, key things one needs to be concerned about here are public and central registers of beneficial ownership. I'm going to come back and make a few remarks about how you might respond to this. There have been a couple of references to FATCA, which has, that virus is spread globally. It's going to be replicated in the OECD Common Reporting System, which is going to predominate across the world. This is a very interesting project because for the first time, countries that have previously tracked only income and gains annually will get information on the net worth of their citizens invested abroad. It's very peculiar in the sense that the United States will get more information about its citizens' financial assets abroad than they collect at home. Because at home, they only check net worth once on death. Under FATCA, they'll get net worth information on an annual basis, and this is transformative change. You add this to the proposal for central registers for beneficial ownership and what that project will do. Again, for the first time in history, it will create large-scale disclosure of ownership of private assets, because every significant assets from the corner grocery store to a power station is held in corporate form. And if you are obliged to disclose ultimate beneficial ownership of that, you will make transparent to the world who owns everything. And I'm not necessarily passing judgment on that, but it's a big change. Of course, here you have some impact with the base erosion and profit shifting, which Ron very helpfully commented on. The last point, of course, is you may have noticed this, I'm not sure if you have, but FATF guidance accompanying their recommendations has provided in October that countries should create public registers of directors of companies. Now, I'm not a fan of public registers of shareholders, of ultimate beneficial ownership of shares, but I do think it is intellectually correct to have central registers of directors of companies. After all, they manage and control companies. The public has a right to know who manages and controls them. As a matter of corporate law, shareholders do not control companies, and in fact, they don't have to fund them beyond their initial share contribution. So I don't really understand intellectually why we should have to make shareholders public. I'm not sure the public has an interest in that. But directors, yes, they have a right to know, and I think BVI should consider moving towards adoption of this FATF requirement. And I actually think this will be good for the local economy, because clients who formerly sat on boards will now ask you to do it and build substance in the jurisdiction. So I think economically, this is a rather attractive proposition for you to develop a public register of directors. Now, there's a lot of perception that people use BVI companies or offshore companies as hidey holes for tax mischief. I mean, that's the predominant theme in the press. And the reality is This is actually very wrong. The main use of BVI companies is actually for in a lot of countries where it's tax neutral, they operate territorial systems. Asia and emerging countries are the biggest users of BVI companies. This illustrates why one might use a BVI company to invest in China. If you were going to build a toll road in China, the NGOs would say to me, Christian Aid, etc., why do you have to go through BVI? Why don't you just go directly into a Chinese company? Well, imagine your toll road. You want to get money from international investors. You conclude arrangements under Chinese law, and there's ultimately a dispute, and your financier wants to get their money back, and they have to go to a Chinese court under Chinese law using a Chinese lawyer. Do they feel comfortable with the predictability of the result in that forum? Probably not. If they do that in BVI, where they have the access to the professional class and British laws, they feel comfortable that there will be a predictable outcome for the dispute. It facilitates global business. That's why people use BVI for international investment, is because they have confidence in the resolution of disputes here. And China, in a very deft move, in effect rents foreign institutions the confidence that the international investors have in British Virgin Islands and the other British territories in order to secure that international investment, because otherwise the international financier would not contribute the money into the Chinese court, because he knows that Chinese judge is not giving his money back if the toll road project's going to collapse, whatever his legal entitlement. If he does it here, they're comfortable that there will be a predictable outcome. Another key use of BVI companies, of course, is for fund purposes. And I say when I'm dealing with a Scottish member of Parliament in the United Kingdom, he says to me, my constituents hate tax havens. They have nothing to do with them. They think they're just used by rich people and multinational companies. They dodge their tax. I have to pay more tax. And our social services are degraded. So I say, well, do your constituents have workplace pensions? He says, yeah. So I said, well, are they invested internationally and diversified into high growth economies? And he says, well, I hope so. So I say, well, how do you think that happens? I mean, that happens through places like this that conduct efficient intermediation of funds into the international environment and fund the pensions for that Scottish Member of Parliament's constituents that can't be funded by UK domestic government finance. And the value of a story like that is it makes it clear to him at an individual level that he and his constituents will suffer in their own pocketbook if their dumb policies put you out of business or impose regulation on you that doesn't make sense. You know, these are the kinds of ways you get to them and explain, we add value to your environment. As to standards in this jurisdiction, you'll be aware that an Australian professor, Jason Sharman, did a study a couple of years ago with a couple of American academics. They contacted 7,500 corporate service providers in 180 countries worldwide. They wrote to them and they said, we want to establish a company, and we don't want to pay excessive tax, and maybe we're from a Muslim charity or something, sort of plant some seeds that might suggest a bit of mischief in mind, terrorist finance or tax evasion. And they checked to see what this corporate service provider asked for. It was a blind test. They checked to see if the corporate service provider asked for passport documents, for proof of address like FATF requires, and they just tabulated the results. And here's the full data set that looks at where various countries got to in their responses. The top jurisdictions in the world, the most compliant jurisdictions in the world, were the British overseas territories and crown dependencies, and at the very bottom of the list is the United States, and about halfway down is the United Kingdom. So when I sit down with a politician in the United Kingdom and he tells me your standards here aren't up to scratch, I put this graph in front of him and say, well, have a look and see where the United Kingdom is, see where the US is, see where your British-inspired law territories are in this. They actually do a pretty good job. So the UK plans central share registers. This is a project of number 10. It's politically driven in an election year. The legislation is now going through Parliament. It looks pretty likely that the United Kingdom will do this. I've been a critic within the United Kingdom about whether this makes sense, whether it complies with the G20 high-level principles that Russell referred to in his remarks. There are two key flaws in the UK system. The first one is there's no verification of shareholder identity. They just ask the shareholder to self-report. And the constituency, of course, they're really interested. Probably a lot of people will report accurately, but who cares about them? The constituency they're interested in is the 2 or 3% who lie, cheat, and steal for a living. Now, with due respect, that constituency is probably not worried about the corporate registrar. They don't have an army, they don't have a police force or enforcement capability. They're going to report whatever they want, and no one's going to check the documents in that country. We already saw that in this jurisdiction, you do require those documents pretty routinely before you're prepared to establish the company. So your compliance levels are high. In the United Kingdom, they won't achieve the most basic requirement of FATF principles, which is to verify data. I pressed them to show me why they think they're going to get there in terms of satisfying FATF requirements, and that one's a struggle for them, I can tell you. The other peculiar thing is that the UK plans apply only to UK companies and limited liability partnerships. They don't apply to foreign companies carrying on business in the United Kingdom by way of branch. So if you want to circumvent UK requirements, all you need to do is establish a company in Delaware, and if you don't have business conducted in the United States, that's tax-free as we all know. You can use that company to carry on business in the United Kingdom, and you don't have to comply with UK requirements for disclosure of beneficial ownership. Now, how does that make sense for the United Kingdom? They're not going to, anybody who's interested in circumventing their legislation has an easy way out, and they're going to lose control of their corporate base. So I'm not sure even in their own interest, and this is the point I make when I talk to UK policymakers, don't worry about us here in the offshore world. What about you? Does this policy work for you? Are you going to capture the data and be FATF compliant and actually find out who's beyond the people doing business in your country? And what about Chinese investors? How comfortable do you think they are culturally with putting beneficial ownership of the ultimate beneficial owner of their investors in the United Kingdom on the public record? It's not in your interest to do it. So the United Kingdom's put pressure on BVI to make a public commitment to move towards a central register. You're asking yourselves, of course, what happens if we publish our client list? I think you got a sense of that last April when the ICIJ data leak splashed the names of your clients all over the press. In my view, this would not be a positive development to move in the direction of a public register of beneficial ownership. So what are your options here? Well, you could agree to do it. I think that's commercially quite challenging for you. You could push back on UK pressure. Now, one needs to be careful about this. It's a long game. You don't want to be confrontational. You want to be cooperative, but at the same time, you need to be sensitive to the commercial impact this would have on you. You could ask the United Kingdom to explain how its model will comply with FATF, and I've done that, and I can tell you their answer is not very convincing on this point. And the other thing you could do is to refine the design and execution of your current system. It's really a two-pronged strategy I would recommend. One is to say to the United Kingdom, we're not really sure you're in the vanguard because we don't think you're compliant with FATF, and here's why. But secondly, we understand the need to upgrade standards, and we're happy to migrate our model. And here's a few ideas that we have in mind for you. And I would stage implementation of those ideas because I guess you've noticed whenever you do something that Tax Justice Network or one of those agencies calls for, they never give you credit, right? They never pause and say, oh, this is great, you're welcome into the family of international cooperative jurisdictions. They bag that concession and they're immediately on to the next one. So the stage delivery is probably the way to do it. You know, you say, well, this is our plan. We're going to execute over a 2-year period. Here's the milestones. This is where we get to at this point. You see, my first comment here is the foreign introducer business, where the beneficial ownership is captured outside BVI, is a bit of a challenge in the sense that sometimes when the United Kingdom, I'm sure you get this comment, Premier, when you talk to the UK, sometimes when they come and they look for the information, it's not here because it's held with a foreign introducer. Now, I suspect this is overblown. Simon Filmer, who I know is a big expert on this, tells me that it would be important to check the UK's facts on this matter, which I think would be a logical starting point. But if you wanted to migrate this, and I can see why there is international pressure to do it, as I mentioned, a staged approach would be good. So with existing business, I'd say, maybe within 18 months, you need to get, or within a year, you need to get the name of the beneficial owner, and within another 18 months, you need to engage in a paper chase and get the paper here. So you've got like a 2-year program or a 2.5-year program to do this. This would give time for the rest of the world to catch up and may well be the pragmatic thing to do. In a sense, I'm not sure that's intellectually correct to do that, because in a globally coherent system where the information's in Hong Kong and it claims to be FATF compliant, shouldn't it be able to produce the information if it claims to be FATF compliant? But nevertheless, as a pragmatic matter, if they ask for the information from BVI and they don't get it, they blame you. So sometimes, and I appreciate this results in a business loss here in BVI, but sometimes it's appropriate to cut off the bottom layer of business and just accept the fact that long-term survival requires a bit of migration and business cost, and in the long term, it guarantees a sustainable environment here. My second suggestion would be to establish a central and public registry of directors, which I've mentioned earlier. I think since you've got CRS and FATCA, you've got parallel programs that suggest that there is a central database of information being collected here at government level. Maybe this makes central public registers redundant. In my view, it probably does. And finally, I think it's also important, as I've mentioned, to explain to onshore politicians and ideally the media, although it's a tough job. Christopher's going to comment on this, getting to the media to explain to the world why you're doing a job that benefits them. They're a blunt instrument to operate through, but Christopher's the expert, so I'm going to defer to him on that one, and then we'll have an opportunity for a bit of discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.